All right, well, welcome everyone to the third installment of the SFP Sage webinar series. We're hosting this webinar series to introduce seafood companies, seafood supply chain to the Gender Equality Dialogues. It's a program to promote innovation and workforce development in the seafood sector. As part of this process we've been doing with Sage, SFP is also working with Sage to pilot their Gender Equity Index tool. And we're going to share an update on that process on our next webinar scheduled right now for mid-November. The last thing I would say is that recordings and slide decks from the previous webinars are available on the SFP website. And that means that, as you just picked up on, this webinar is also being recorded. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Becca.
Awesome. Thanks, Dave. Good morning. Good afternoon, everybody. It's really nice to be here with you all today. I am Becca Williams. I'm the Director of Gender Strategies for SAGE, or Seafood and Gender Equality. So I currently oversee a couple of our programs, like Dave mentioned, our Gender Equity Index, which is a self-assessment that seafood companies and organizations can take that gives a score and some guidance on how to improve some gender equality metrics. We also have our Gender Equality Dialogues, and that's the program that I'll be speaking more specifically to today in terms of the public commitments that we worked on in the pilot cohort, as well as the framework that we've put together to help companies formulate their kind of internal facing commitments. And I'll explain more about how the GED operates and functions in the next couple of minutes. So first, I think some of you all are new, or at least I haven't seen some of you all in these spaces before. So I'd love to get to know you all a bit better. If you could put in the chat your name, your job title, if you'd like, what company you work for, and then finish the sentence, a gender equitable seafood industry would be one where ... So if you could put in that information in the chat, I'll give you all a couple of minutes to do that. You could just put the last half of that sentence in the chat. You don't have to type it all out. Hi, Felicia. Thank you. Joining all the way from Nigeria. Thank you so much for being here. Hi, Amy. Hi, Clara. Thank you. Christina, nice to meet you. I don't think we've met before. It's nice to meet you or see you in this space.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Becca. We met at the CAS meeting in Canada.
Oh, okay. I saw Smartfish and I was like, I feel like that's probably the place where we would have met if we did.
I'm still thinking about your complete this.
Yeah. We have a couple minutes here, so. So I can say for me, when I think about a gender equitable seafood sector, which I think about all of the time, I was just going to say something very similar to what Amy wrote, where everyone has access to resources and opportunities regardless of gender. I'm thinking along the lines of a seafood sector that sort of embraces, it's a very like human-centered industry that focuses a lot on uplifting well-being and seeing people kind of in their entirety and supports them feeling included and welcome in the workplace. Yeah, that's great, Amy. And we really believe at Sage that a rising tide lifts all boats. So working on gender equality within your company or organization has the potential to really improve the experience of every employee, regardless of their gender identity and other identities that they hold. Awesome. So we can go ahead and move on to the next. Feel free to keep putting stuff in the chat as we go along. And if you have questions, you can unmute yourself and or put it in the chat. And if we have time to answer it right away, I will, or there's also going to be time at the end. So like Dave said, this is the third installment of the webinar series. We spent the first two speaking a little bit more in depth about the gender equality dialogues, sort of how the program came to be and what the curriculum looks like and how the curriculum that I developed for the program addresses various workforce challenges. Today, we're going to speak a little bit about some of the essential kind of guiding documents that we use and that we built in the first cohort of the GED. So because not all of y'all have been in the first two webinars, I'll first go through a little bit of a refresher on what the GED is, and then we'll kind of get into the framework and the public commitments. We are still working on the portal. So we have, we're developing a membership portal for GED participants to be able to access everything that they need through like a website where they log in, like an intranet. And then we weren't able to find a GED alumni who had the availability to come be with us this morning for a Q&A. But if you all have any questions that you would like to ask somebody who went through the GED, please feel free to pass those along to me and I can pass those along to those folks. Or if it's broad enough, I might be able to answer it myself. The next one we have is in mid-November. And like Dave said, that is going to be going over how our process was working with SFP through our Gender Equity Index tool. So a bit about where we're going today. We just did the first part, the why we are here. So it's really important to kind of ground our work in the idea that supporting and promoting gender equality in the sector really has the potential to uplift everybody. And that is one of the main goals of SAGE, and that really forms the basis for the work that we do with the GED and also the Gender Equity Index. I'll do a brief overview of the GED to refresh your memories, and then we'll speak a little bit more about the public-facing commitments and the framework, which helps folks sort of measure out their internal-facing commitments. And then we have some light breakout group stuff at the end, as well as time for questions and comments. Okay, so this slide might look familiar if you were at the first two webinars. So the little image on the left of the slide is SAGE's theory of change. So what we think will happen if we support gender, if we mainstream gender, which basically means supporting companies and organizations and sort of infusing gendered considerations into every aspect of their policies, their programs, their procedures, their operations. So really taking what's known as a gender lens or understanding the different gender dynamics that might happen in a workplace and talking through figuring out where that happens throughout a company's sort of profile and existence. So we believe that if we do work to promote gender equality in the sector, that the sector will become more responsible and more resilient. So a lot of our work in our programs is focused on kind of testing out that hypothesis and seeing how we do. So our mission is to uplift, amplify, and integrate diverse voices into the seafood sector. We have a couple of programs that do that. Our website is pretty accessible. We're in the process of redoing it, so it's a little bit easier to navigate now. And that outlines a lot of the other programs that we have, including our podcast and our membership group called The Bloom. The GED was a program that we piloted last year, so it wrapped up last July. And we piloted that program with 3 seafood companies: Seattle Fish, Acme Smoked Fish, and Fortune Fish and Gourmet. And essentially the GED is a curriculum-based program. So we met 12 times. We had a curriculum that I built out alongside the representatives who were participating in the GED from those 3 companies. So the curriculum is really kind of tailored and bespoke and fits the needs of the seafood sector. This was a big part of our pilot, was figuring out what information worked and what information we could really benefit from having companies kind of learn and talk through. We had representatives from each company participate, and we met once a month, so it was a year. And we had representatives from human resources as well as sustainability. In this current cohort, we have representatives from kind of warehousing and production as well as operations. And we want to make sure that at least one of those company representatives has a direct line to C-suite or executive leadership, because we want to make sure that we have the buy-in of leadership at every step of the way. So the main outcomes for the GED are that at least the pilot, were to come up with the wording for the public commitments, which we'll go over later in the presentation. And those are the commitments that we expect every future company who signs on to the GED to sign on to and uphold and agree with. So sort of like what we're committing to through the GED and what we're committing to in our lives, our professional lives after the GED. We also have companies work on internal facing commitments. And those are commitments that are unique and specific to each company and that are private. So those stay within the space of the GED. Those are not publicized unless the individual company wants to publicize those. And we work through a whole process, quite a significantly, not complicated process, but a complex process to help companies understand where they want to focus that internal facing commitment on and what they want to do to improve gender equality within their companies through that commitment. So an example might be reworking a maternity leave policy to kind of broaden it to be a parental leave policy, to make it accessible to everybody in the company regardless of their gender. So that would be an example of an internal facing commitment. So something measurable and actionable that companies feel they can get started on during the space of the GED. So we are now in our second cohort. It began a couple of months ago, last month actually, and we shortened the time. So instead of meeting once a month for a year, actually with this cohort they decided to meet once every 3 weeks. So it will be about 7.5 or 8 months that we'll be spending time with them. And it's really, one of the things I like most about it is how invested and curious the participants are in how they can work to promote gender equity within their spaces. So here's a breakdown of the curriculum. The last webinar that I hosted did a much deeper dive into the 3 different parts of the curriculum. So if you're really curious about that, I'm happy to answer any questions about that at the end. You can also watch the recording from the last webinar that really goes into it. And I think we did a little kind of trial or test run with the participants on a chunk of the curriculum altogether. So the 12 sessions are broken out into 3 phases. There's the first phase, which is about building gender awareness, and that comprises the first 5 sessions. And then there's the second phase, which is about taking some of those concepts and doing a gender analysis. That is 3 sessions. And then the last phase is the remaining 4 sessions, and that is about gender action. So you can see here in the little check boxes, these are some of the outputs and outcomes from each phase. So the first phase, gender awareness, we really introduce folks to the concept of gender equality, what gender is, what we're talking about when we're using specific terms. We want to build a shared understanding and alignment and really build some group cohesion with the understanding that these companies are likely naturally in competition with one another. and we want to build out a sense of collaboration in a way that is not competitive or pre-competitive. We have companies fill out a baseline survey, which gives us a sense of kind of what policies they already have in place that they're really proud of, what policies they might want to work on, how they approach certain issues within the workplace. And then we focus a bit on what it means to become gender transformative. And that's a huge topic in and of itself. A summary version of that is looking at what it means to address a lot of the systemic inequities within a company, as opposed to doing really sort of checkboxy gender equality things. So really looking at why it is that the company culture is the way that it is, and trying to address some more deeply rooted systems of inequity. The second phase is gender analysis. There we focus a bit more on gender equality in the corporate sector, specifically in the corporate seafood sector. We spend a lot of time doing a specific SWOT analysis to understand what exactly is happening within the company culture of the companies that are participating. And then we introduce folks, if they haven't already been working with or are familiar with the employee life cycle. This is something that usually our HR folks are familiar with, but it's a way to describe an employee's experience from the time that they're first introduced to a company, or first kind of lay eyes on a company through recruiting materials or a website, all the way through until they leave the company or retire. So it's a way to describe or categorize an employee's entire experience throughout their tenure with their workplace. And it's broken up into 5, sometimes 6 different categories. And so we learn about that, and what we end up doing is each company chooses one element of the employee life cycle to really focus in their internal facing commitment on. And then the third phase is really where a lot of this stuff comes together. That's where we really go deep into the gender action framework, which I have some snippets of in the next couple of slides, where companies start to develop the wording for their internal facing commitments and the rationale. And then throughout the whole GED, we make sure that the participants are regularly checking in with leadership. Right. So these are our public commitments. They are public, so you can see them on our website. Companies who participate in the GED, like the company that's currently participating, has signed on to these. They are things that each company can put on their own website if they want, after or during their participation in the GED. And this was one of the biggest or most important outcomes for me in facilitating the pilot cohort, was the development of these public-facing commitments. It took a lot of time for all of us to kind of land on, or I guess build alignment with the wording, with what we wanted to articulate and how we wanted to articulate what we think the sector could benefit from if we incorporated gender equality into the seafood sector. We spent a lot of time on the first part. So the part that starts with, we believe that by having a diverse workforce, we will have a stronger, more resilient sector. That is sort of our hypothesis. So we went back and forth a lot on the need to have a business case. And this is another topic that I could do an entire presentation on. I actually have done an entire presentation on this whole process of talking about a business case with these companies, because it was really interesting. And I understand the need. A lot of companies have expressed a need to sort of justify the rationale for their spending their time on this and really committing to whatever internal facing commitment they're going to commit to. So they want to make sure that they get a return on investment and that could look a lot of different ways. And so while there is a lot of evidence out there in other corporate sectors for, gender equality, improving workforce development through boosting innovation and retention and employee engagement and profitability and, less companies doing less greenwashing, there's not a lot of information specific to the corporate or sustainable seafood sector. And so we really wanted to make sure that what we were saying felt like it applied to the industry that everybody was in. At the same time, a lot of the companies felt like gender equality is sort of the right thing to do, and that it was difficult to apply sort of a profit-based rationale or justification for promoting gender equality within their companies. There's also, not a huge amount of data around gender equality in the seafood sector, specifically this part of the supply chain. And so, which is why SAGE exists and why we're able to do the amazing work that we do. So there are a lot of reasons that we spend a lot of time kind of talking back and forth about, and we came up with the idea of kind of having this hypothesis where we would test our ideas on this and kind of see, this is a long-term investment that these companies are making. So see over the years if these things are coming true. So that's the first part. The second portion of this is the actual 3 public commitments. So again, these are evergreen, meaning that companies who sign on to join the GED will sign on to these commitments. And we spent a couple of months really parsing out the language and the wording here. It was a really iterative process. And so I think, for me, a lot of this has to do with really being a leader in the sector and the industry when it comes to promoting diversity and equity within the industry, and noting that there might be things within a company's own operations that could either limit or kind of serve as a catalyst or facilitator for promoting gender equity. So taking sort of a macro look at how we want to show up and who we're accountable to in this huge sector as a whole, and then also being able to look inwardly at how, we show up in our professional lives. So those are the commitments. I want to ask some questions to you all about that if you're interested in sort of thinking through what it might look like for either your company or the sector as a whole to serve as a champion for gender equity in seafood. We're running a bit behind on time, so if you do want to take some time to think about that and pop that in the chat, I'd be happy to chat about that as it comes up. I think that word champion was one that we went back and forth on a lot in terms of what was kind of expected, what that word entailed. And it was something that ultimately each company felt like they could do and carry forth. And that would be a good sort of expectation for following companies to join onto. Does anybody have any questions specifically about the commitments or our process of building them? All right. So the public-facing commitments are public-facing. They're the outward ones that companies can and will sort of be able to access at any point in time. They can put it in any of their reporting that they want to place it in. It's accessible on our website. The framework that we've put together, that is to help companies build out that internal facing commitment, or that commitment that's really unique and specific to their own companies. So this is a framework that we, myself in conjunction with a consultant, built out over the course of basically an entire year. It was a really involved process. And it's sort of a piece that I'm really proud of in terms of what it helps these companies to do and sort of think through. So the introduction there on the top part of the slide is also the introduction to the framework. So essentially, it helps support companies through the process of building out their internal facing commitments and their action plans. So we want to make sure that companies aren't just saying, this is what we're going to do, but that they've actually thought through what it takes to do this. We've learned that a lot of companies sort of start this process having really high hopes and expectations. For example, that by the end of their time with the GED, they are hoping to have, gender parity or perhaps their first woman CEO. And we really want to help them understand that is a very noble, amazing goal. However, that takes a very long time. And we've noticed in research that's emerged in the last 20 years since sort of the concept of gender mainstreaming has become more widespread, that it can be really helpful for organizations or companies to focus on something measurable and achievable and possible, so that you can build excitement and motivation to be able to get the momentum that you need to make those really big changes. So this framework really helps folks see that, the devil is really in the details with this. So even if the internal facing commitment feels inconsequential or rather small compared to the work that companies want to be doing, that there is actually a huge amount of work that's involved in fleshing it out and involving the right stakeholders and doing a budget analysis and making sure that you have the right actions and metrics in place to make sure that you can be successful in carrying it out. So the Gender Action Framework is there to do that. We have this in our portal, or we will have it in our portal when our portal is ready, and each company gets their own version of this. The framework essentially is a workbook that helps document the process of identifying their goals and really aligning those goals with the public-facing commitments. So there's a lot of dialogue between the public-facing commitments and their internal-facing commitments. Again, so we can tie those things to one another and sort of test out that hypothesis that I went over in the last slide. The framework also helps companies and organizations evaluate their short-term and long-term successes and challenges. So it's divided into 8 tabs or 8 sheets. The first one is an introduction and how to use this guide explanation, which is really helpful. The second is companies fill out some takeaways from that baseline survey, which is something that they take in the first part of the curriculum. So they take it usually between the first and second session of the GED. So they will look at their answers and responses from that and fill out a couple of reflective questions based on that. The third helps with sort of framing the issue, and that's where we do a deeper dive into that SWOT analysis. And we spend a whole session on how to fill out this specific SWOT analysis, which addresses the way in which gender shows up in various parts of a company culture. And then we have a tab on workforce composition. So looking at, who is currently at the company, what roles do they have, what is a gendered breakdown. And this slide is, we're noticing kind of a difficult one for companies to fill out, either because they might not have or gather this information, or the information we're asking for might be different than what they're required to gather. So we at Sage are really kind of clear that we want the sector to go in this direction where we understand that gender identity and gender falls on a spectrum, and that while there's not necessarily just a binary men and women, there are gender non-binary folks, trans folks, a lot of people who exist kind of in between those two binary concepts of what it means to be male and female. And we really want to embrace that and understand what the experiences of those folks are, so that we can build policies to make them feel safe and included and welcome in the workplace. We also know that people are not necessarily gathering data on gender expansive terms that go beyond sort of men and women in the workplace. But we hope that in this next generation that we do gather that information, and that we can do it in a way that is really about building gender transformative policies that look at some of those deeper underlying structures. So the workforce composition is something that we ask folks to understand that this is something that we're hoping that they will be able to do, is to get a sense of who exactly is in their workplace and what they might need. And we also understand the reality that for now, people are mostly gathering information in a voluntary capacity about the gendered breakdown as it relates to just men and women. So that's the 4th tab. I'm happy to speak more on that. That's always a process that's in process. Then our 5th tab, the commitments and action plan, that's where the bulk of the work is done. So that's where companies really take the time to kind of flesh out their commitments and to tie them back to those public-facing commitments. I'll show a snippet of that on the next slide. And because tab 5 is so intensive. We have like a bucket of ideas that companies can pull from on tab 6. So we ask that companies think of actions that they can take to work toward their internal facing commitment. And we have a potential action list or like an action bank that they can pull from that's pretty extensive to kind of get their creative juices flowing. And then the 7th tab, we have an example action plan that we've put together so they can see how to fill it out. And then we also have a graphic of our employee life cycle that we reference throughout. So we don't introduce this all at once to participants because that would be incredibly overwhelming. We work on this sort of tab by tab throughout the whole curriculum. So we start with the framework, I think, in the 2nd or 3rd session of the GED, where we start working on the 1st and 2nd tabs, and then we kind of move through it all together as a cohort. Are there any questions on that or how that is organized or anything related to what I'm sort of talking about with the framework? All right, so this slide is probably a little bit overwhelming to look at. I don't know if you can actually see it. I tried to do a screenshot. The type looks really small to me, but essentially this is part of tab 5. So on the left-hand column, you will see, or if you can't see, it's broken into 3 chunks. Those are the 3 public-facing commitments that we saw a couple slides ago. The second to the left is what we're calling focal areas. So we've broken down the 3 public commitments into different sort of themes or focus areas that we're hoping companies can further break down when they're thinking about their internal facing commitments. So when we have companies fill this out, it is not our expectation that they will fill out every box. This is a very comprehensive document, and their internal facing commitment will likely not address every single one of these, but we want them to think about the intersections between, what is the company's policy on transparency and their strategy on letting employees know what they're doing, and how does that tie into their internal facing commitment of having a paid parental leave program. If we wanted to think about that, they don't have to fill out every single box. It would be quite a big undertaking, but we do ask them to fill out the ones that are applicable to their commitments. So then we have in the 3rd column from the left, the vision, or what do the companies want to achieve? And that is to sort of get them to think big. So beyond the scope of the GED curriculum, what are they hoping that this internal facing commitment will do? We also take some time throughout the curriculum to tie in the internal facing commitments to their business goals and outcomes and or their sustainability goals and outcomes. And so this is the space for them to more concretely think about that and put down their ideas for how their gender equality goals match their business goals. And then you can see we have an actions column. So these are kind of the activities that the companies will undertake, whether that's running an employee satisfaction survey to see how people feel about the parental leave policy, or starting to gather some data on policy usage with a breakdown of who uses it, how long they use it for, looking into benchmarking other companies that might have a paid parental leave policy, for example. Those can be different actions that companies can undertake in alignment with their internal facing commitment. And then we ask them to think through what they will track and measure, and then who from the company will be involved with each action. So making sure that you have the right stakeholders at the table for this. And then it goes on, I think, 3 or 4 more columns around budget. I think there's 1 or 2 that I'm blanking on right now. And then sort of the update on the progress of this, like, is this something that's completed or in process? So this is a quick snapshot of the 5th tab of our framework. Again, each company has their own copy of this that they will work on throughout the course of the GED and spend some time together outside of our GED sessions to go over it. Okay, so I am going to see how many people do we have in this. Can I get a sense from you all if you feel like going into breakout groups, or you'd rather discuss one of these questions all together as a big group?
We could just stay in the big group.
Yeah, for sure. Let's do that. Okay. So I think this is the framing tab. So the third part of the framework asks people to start thinking a little bit about two concepts that we spend some time talking about in the GED. And that is the concept of intersectionality and the concept of gender equality as it relates to sustainability. And so we are still working through, our approach to gender equality and sustainability in terms of like, how does it relate? Each company has different sustainability policies and practices. Some of them might be directly tied to gender depending on where they are in the supply chain. Some of them might not be. And so we're quite flexible with this approach, and we understand that each company approaches it a little bit differently. In terms of intersectionality, this is something that is pretty important in our discussions as a cohort. And it's around the idea that when we're looking at gender equality, we're not just looking at men and women. There are a whole host of other identities that each person holds as it relates to their race, their class, their nationality, their citizenship status, their ability, and sort of where they are geographically. And those identities intersect so that each person has a unique lived experience that can differ from anybody else based on those identities. So we've noticed, for example, that when we ask people to really think about this, something that comes up for them is like, oh, we do a really great job with gender in our management positions. We have a lot of women in management roles. And then when we ask them to think a little bit more critically about that, it kind of comes to light that, 90% of those women are white women. So how do we work to take an intersectional view and sort of expand our scope of what we can do to really incorporate a sense of equity and diversity within management? So since we're all working together, I'd love for us to think about these questions. We can think about start with the first one, intersectionality, but let's expand it. So we're not just thinking about our own companies, but so we're thinking about the seafood sector as a whole. So the second one, I'll start with the second one. So have you noticed any gaps or patterns in who holds leadership roles, who participates in decision-making, or who feels a strong sense of belonging? And you can extrapolate that to think about the whole seafood sector. You can think about your own company if you want to. We're trying to get at any patterns or trends that we're noticing in terms of who has a sense of belonging and who is really making decisions in the sector.
Becca, how do you want us to think about this if we are working with companies, but not a company directly?
You can think about it with the companies that you work with.
Okay.
Or you can think about your own experience in the seafood sector and what you've noticed either at conferences or on any like panels or anything like that.
Got it.
Don't force anybody to chat if they're not feeling chatty. We can move on to the second question if you all want to. This was also the end of my presentation, so we can also move straight into questions, general questions, if you all have any general questions. I know it's early for some of us, and breakout groups are kind of tough to stomach if this early in the morning. So we can, if folks want to chat about these questions on the slide here, you're more than welcome to. Does anybody have any general questions about the presentation or any of the information that I shared, or any comments?
I have a question. I'm curious. I'm not, and I guess you guys can confirm, but a lot of the companies who are in the cohorts maybe already have a partnership with SFP or with other I guess nonprofits that are advising them on different types of sustainability issues. To what extent is SF, well, I know you just put something in the chat, but is SFP not like required to self-examine on the same parameters that you're asking the companies to audit or examine, and or not? I'm just, and what's been the experience there? So
No, it's a great question, Christina. I'll jump in and answer that. So we were, we at SFP were very excited and very happy to join this partnership with Sage. At the beginning of the year, we've been collaborating one way or another for a couple of years and hosting Sage at our booth in Boston because we really enjoy the work they do. I've known Julie for nearly 15 or 16 years, so it's a great pleasure to be able to work with her again. I would say that I put the framing of our policy in there, and that was a new one that was developed at the beginning of the year. So we're going to be kind of re-examining that, or late last year, beginning of this year. So sort of re-examining that through our internal process with Sage and see how we can build it out. Again, I think you'll see right there that the scope of issues that we're working at is much broader than just gender, which is not to diminish it. It's just like we're looking for the whole thing. So, to your question about, I guess I would reframe it where we are relative to the companies we work with. We're probably way ahead of most of them. I think there's, you'll probably find a difference in some ways between a major retailer or a major food service company that has the resources and capacity to have a broader view on these issues. Now, where they go with that obviously is up to the company, and it certainly in North America has been changed quite dramatically in the last 6 months, at least what they're able to talk about publicly and put forward publicly. I think that one of the goals of this work with Sage was to focus a bit more on mid-supply chain companies that don't have that capacity, that may be needing a bit more nudging or support, or maybe have some really cool things in place or want to have some really cool things in place and just need that capacity and guidance from an advisor like Sage to allow that to happen, to guide them through the process. And that was, so our two goals for this work with Sage were, one, that to try and bring the nearly 100 companies that we work with through our supply chain roundtables, particularly, certainly in inviting the 30 or so giant large corporations we work with corporate partnerships, and bring them into that process. So far, maybe hasn't quite worked as well. We haven't got the attention that we hope for, but that's part of the reason we've put all these recordings on our website, so that if people don't have the time right now to go through a webinar, they can go back and review the materials and review the slides. And then again, internally, we are always looking for opportunities to do better. I would say that at SFP, even then, 2 years ago when you started these conversations with Sage, I kind of took a rough look at our numbers, and if we look at a man-woman balance across our organization, it's pretty good at all levels, on the board, on the leadership team, on the staff. On the staff, we have a very wide cultural diversity because we work in 17, 18, we have staff in 17, 18, 19, 20 countries around the world. I would say, and I haven't looked recently, but I would say probably at the upper end of things, partly because so much of our work is North American and European focused. We're a bit more on the white gender diverse than we are on racial and perhaps other diversity metrics. But so we're always looking for ways to improve that. I think we have a pretty good, solid policy in place. I don't know that it's public right now. Always looking to do better, and then certainly in what practices we can put together. Again, we've also over the last couple of years really revamped and built out a solid what we call people and culture team. So even just by changing the name, we've upped the status of it from a human resources team to really guiding our people and organizational culture.
Can I add a comment? Thanks for your question, Christina. And I think you asked your words. I wrote it down because it was good. It was to what extent is SFP required to self-examine? And I think, you know, that's a question for them, obviously, but part of our kind of agreement with them, our partnership agreement with SFP is to not only host these webinars with the supplier, you know, so the members of supplier roundtables can join, but also to support us in piloting our gender equity index tool. And so this index tool, Becca hasn't really, you didn't dive deep into this tool here, but this is something that we're piloting that gives companies, organizations an opportunity to self-assess their policies and their practices. And the goal with SFP is that we hope that we can be very open and public about kind of, you know, not necessarily getting into the nitty-gritty details, but their experience about piloting this tool with us and actions that they might protect, or, you know, gaps or areas that they could improve on or do, you know, whatever they decide, and kind of work on like an iterative process, almost like a fishery improvement project. So it's a gender improvement project. Maybe let's not go there. So, but that's it. So there's no per se requirement other than what the law requires, obviously, but a lot of what I think Becca was getting to in our in that framework is that we're asking people to go kind of above and beyond what's legally required in some cases, because, you know, as you might know, or you might not know, in the US, legal requirements around parental leave are abysmal, right? And so we really want to see improvements in some of these areas. And SFP is, while not legally required to do any of this, they are working with us to help us, because what we really want to see is what we know is the next generation of kind of the workforce is coming up, and they're not going to put up with the same stuff that I put up with when I was younger, or even, you know, maybe y'all. And so we really want to make sure that we're developing these kind of equitable pathways to build a better seafood industry. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, I mean, thank you both. I think my curiosity comes a little bit from, you know, it seems like, you know, Sage, SFP, and the company are in kind of a collaborative kind of, not triangle, but whatever, however you want to see it. And you know, SFP's relationship with these companies may precede and like extend beyond the collaboration with Sage. So how can kind of that be integrated in a way that, you know, SFP is prepared to kind of follow up on some of the work done with Sage? And I just think about, you know, like you have to have your own house in order before you can kind of work with others on this stuff. So it was really, yeah, both comments were really helpful. And thinking about it from Smartfish's perspective too. I mean, I'm working in my role with some private companies, but mostly we're working with cooperatives. But, you know, right now we're still in the phase of getting our own house in order.
Yeah, and I would emphasize that as well, because my background is from working with fisheries, and first working to get them into environmental improvement or environmental sustainability initiatives like MSC, and then working with them to get into a fishery improvement project. And we see it now, you know, the companies are like, we will source from you if you do this, this, and this, and the burden of implementation and the burden of financing falls on the fisheries or further down the supply chain before anybody even starts to look at themselves. And so that was a huge driver in forming Sage. And that was at the forefront of my mind, is like, now we're kind of trying to retrofit a bunch of worker voice and, you know, worker protections into these systems that we all create. I was part of this, Dave too. I mean, we'll all fess up. I'm sorry, Dave, I'm putting you in there in the mix, but you know, we were all part of it. So it's our job to actually, again, get our house in order. I firmly agree with that. And how SFP will take this forward is obviously their kind of their responsibility, but Becca does have a system in place of follow-ups and kind of, I don't want to call it accountability check-ins, but similar, right, for members of GED cohorts that they finish them, and then she regularly checks in with them to understand how they are implementing, what issues, challenges they're having, and we do provide guidance post GED. So again, the Gender Equity Index tool is in pilot mode right now. So we, you know, I can't speak to that really about post to that, but maybe Becca can. But, and then the final thing I'll say is, Christina, there is an opportunity. We are going, currently the gender equality dialogues they're built for businesses, right? But we do see the next one will be NGO focused. And so this is a possibility for SFP could certainly join it. I'm not sure if you have, if your desire, but it will definitely be a space for nonprofits who advise businesses, work with fisheries directly, have that NGO kind of, you know, the peculiarities of working in a nonprofit are potentially different than working in a business. So we want to really craft the next iteration of the GED towards nonprofits. And Becca can speak to that a little bit more if you want. But it's exciting.
Yeah.
I'm excited for that one.
Yeah, and that one will look sort of similar in form and structure to the GED for companies, but the substance will be different because NGOs are operating usually from a different set of kind of guiding principles and have different goals and outcomes than seafood companies do. So that will happen. We'll be working on that in the next probably next couple of months or within the next year. So yeah.
Hi.
Great, thank you, Christina.
Hi, sorry. I also had a question. Maybe it was in the first seminar, so I'm sorry if it was already there. I was wondering if you could share some, like, say, information about the profiles of the companies of the cohorts, you know, in terms of, you know, size, what jobs they do exactly in the chain, where they're located, and things like this, just for me to get an idea.
Yes. So the first 3 companies that were in the pilots are seafood distribution companies. And so they, I think total, Julie might have to help me remember this number, but among them, they had over 2,000 employees across all 3.
I think it was 2,300 employees.
2,300, yeah. So some of them have warehouses and like where they do their own processing. Some of them didn't. And so some of them were actively growing in the course of joining the GED. So in our current cohort, we are working with the Chicken of the Sea branch of Thai Union in North America. And so they are a much bigger company. They have a much bigger kind of scope than some of these other companies do, but we're focused on their kind of North American warehouse production plant and offices.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And I think the goal is to have, I mean, it's applicable for anybody really, in anywhere in the supply chain. But I mentioned we're doing a nonprofit focused GED, the next cohort, and then the cohort after that, we're calling it a supply chain GED. And I'm not sure what that means yet, to be perfectly frank. It's a little bit more, so to back up just a second, when we were, even before Becca came on to Sage, we were working on developing the GED in partnership with an organization called Women in Seafood, who's based in France. And they had conducted a global survey of like 700 to 900 seafood industry leaders and people globally. And out of that survey, there was a recommendation to hold a dialogue. Dialogues need to be held. And so we launched this together with Women in Seafood with the idea that we will have a dialogue. And Women in Seafood was very, very adamant about including everyone from anywhere in a supply chain, including fisheries and fishers. And I was less adamant about that because I was, it's as you can imagine, it's a huge undertaking. It's very difficult to get fishers to participate in things like this. And so I was wanting to do it a little bit more stepwise, and then kind of go, starting with the industry and then coming back down to a supply chain, and then kind of like bringing it together at some point. And then Women in Seafood closed in, like, I can't remember, November or December of 2022. And then I'm like, oh, okay, so let's go back to our original idea. So we are going to get there to including the really important feedback and participation of fishers. Thank you, Christina, for joining. And I would like to follow up with you actually later. So I will be reaching out. Becca will too. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So does that make sense? So the supply chain GED is going to happen, and that will include, I hope, the participation of fishers, and people at origin, people on the water. Did I misrepresent that, Becca? Because I think I didn't.
No, you didn't.
It's just a lot, as you can imagine. I mean, you're running a supplier roundtable, which I can't even imagine. Like, I mean, it's a lot.
Yeah.
Herding cats.
I joined very recently, so
Oh, okay.
like 2 months
Sorry, I'm
ago.
not gonna scare you.
2 months
She
ago.
doesn't know
No,
what
it
she's
was-
gotten into yet, so.
No, it's all good. It's all good, but it's a challenge for sure.
Yeah, I can imagine. But it was also, I guess, the question behind my question was that, gender equity might not mean the same for a company in
Correct.
the Western, Eastern world,
Yeah.
So that was kind of the question behind my question, but I also understand you have to go step by step.
Thank
So
you, Amy,
we're-
for joining. Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah, we do. And we take those things into consideration. I think one of the companies we worked with before had some international operations that they were looking to kind of grow. And so we worked with them on how that would look in terms of what the intersectionality piece, like what are some things that they should consider working in contexts that maybe are either more familiar or less familiar with some of these concepts. Yeah, thank you, Clara.
Thank you.
Awesome.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. It was really great to see you all. And yeah, the recording should be up on the website.
Yeah,
soon.
give me a few days or a week. So.
Yeah, of course.
And you got to send me your slides.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
All right.
All right,
Take
thanks,
care,
everyone.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.